here. I'm positive that Janelle's not going to move out here. I finally told Robyn that I really can't stand the idea of living here, at least at this point. Robyn, I think, was the last to give up on the...
For more than a decade, audiences across the world were sold a carefully woven tale, a narrative wrapped in the language of faith, adorned with the imagery of family devotion, and gilded with the promise of a love so profound that it multiplied rather than diminished. And millions of viewers sat transfixed as they watched the Brown family build houses out of hope, rear children in circumstances that seemed unimaginable to most, and maneuver through a way of life that was marketed as unique, authentic, and unshakably bound together. Yet beneath the glossy edits, beneath the tender sound bites and choreographed confessions, lay a reality far darker than the program ever allowed to be seen. Because what the public was told, that their greatest strength was their unity, their oneness, their sacred bond as a family, was not merely a half-truth but an outright fabrication. For their real asset, their true currency, was not the bricks of their homes nor the acres of land they purchased in the desert, but rather their own story, their lived experiences packaged as entertainment, the rights to their lives sold and broadcast to millions of strangers, monetized and transformed into a commodity of extraordinary value. And even the essence of who they were, was taken, twisted, and controlled, not for the collective benefit of the family, but allegedly for the profit and power of a single man. And thus begins the tale not of sister wives, the family, but sister wives, the corporate illusion, an empire forged in secrecy, deception, and contract law. So welcome back to the Sister Wives crew, because what follows is a revelation pieced together from whispers in the shadows, from insiders who could no longer remain silent, from painstaking analysis of documents, filings, and public records, and from theories so meticulously drawn that once you hear them, you cannot unsee them. For this story is not merely about arguments over property lines, about squabbles over affection, about the inevitable jealousies that come when love is divided into fractions. No. This is a story that strikes at the very heart of the family's empire, the very television contract upon which their fame, their wealth, and their public narrative were built. This, dear crew, is the story of the great TLC contract fraud. And before we peel back the curtain fully on this alleged multi-million-pound deception, let us be clear. The wives, the women whose lives, whose tears, whose sacrifices were the substance of the show, deserve justice. They deserve to have their truth spoken plainly. And if you watching or listening believe that as well, if you are exhausted by the secrets and sick of the lies, then know that even your smallest action matters, because in this digital age, pressing the like button, subscribing to the crew, and sharing the story is not idle. It is part of the fight to ensure the truth cannot be buried. It tells the algorithms that this story has weight, that these voices matter, and your support fuels every investigation, every word, every revelation. So with that said, let us dismantle the illusion. Let us unravel the corporate mirage that is hidden in plain sight for years. Because the public was sold the vision of a family more than individuals. A team, a collective, one man, 4 wives, and their 18 children, all portrayed as partners in faith, parenting and finance, working together as one. And when the deal with TLC was signed in 2010, we were invited to believe, indeed we were explicitly told, that this was a family contract, a lucrative agreement designed to lift them all from the financial ruins that had long haunted them. But insiders, those with knowledge of the show's earliest days, whisper a chillingly different truth, that just before the cameras began rolling, just before the premiere changed their lives forever, a new business entity was quietly registered. No fanfare, no announcement, just paperwork filed in the shadows. And though we may call it Patriarch Productions, LLC, or imagine it bore another name such as Brown Family Entertainment or Kody Brown Media, the name itself does not matter, for what matters is the structure, and in that structure lay the seeds of betrayal. Because it is disturbingly common in the world of reality television for networks to demand simplicity, they do not wish to negotiate with 5 or more adults, to juggle multiple contracts and signatures. They prefer one entity, one point of contact, and so they urge families to form what is known as a loan-out corporation, a legal shell through which the family's services are loaned to the production company, and this, in theory, is harmless, efficient even, but in this case, according to legal analysts and insiders alike, Kody Brown allegedly ensured that he alone was listed as the sole member, sole manager, and sole owner of the corporation, cutting out entirely the women who had shared decades of life with him, who had borne his children, who had endured sacrifice after sacrifice, and in doing so, he did not merely secure patriarchal authority in the household, he codified it in corporate law, transforming his wives from partners into employees, or worse. into independent contractors of a company they believed they collectively embodied. And the legal distinction here is vast, because if you are a co-owner of an LLC, you are entitled to a share of profits. You have the legal right to see the books, to know precisely what sums are flowing in, to voice how the money is spent, to possess equity in the very show itself. But if you are merely an employee or a contractor, your entitlement begins and ends with the stipend written into your contract. You have no right to examine profits, no claim to network payments, no ownership, no seat at the table. And thus, when we recall Kody's oft-repeated proclamations of being the head of the household, when we revisit those moments where he insisted on authority, they take on a chilling new resonance, because they were not only spiritual claims, not only patriarchal assertions, but legally binding corporate realities. For he was not just husband, he was CEO. And the women were his workforce. And the alleged scam, though devastating, was deceptively simple because let us turn to the numbers, and here the betrayal becomes glaring. For by conservative estimates, a reality show of this scale, with this longevity, was generating between £2 and £4 million per season in its later years. And even if we take the lower estimate, £2.5 million, that sum did not flow into a shared family account, but directly into Patriarch Productions. And from there, Kody alone determined its fate. While the wives were given stipends that, though seemingly large to women once dogged by bankruptcy, were mere scraps compared to the whole. For if each wife received £150,000 per season, multiplied by 4, that totals $600,000, leaving behind a staggering $1.9 million sitting in Kody's accounts. Profit that he alone could direct, invest, or spend. Profit that the wives, the very stars of the show, had no legal right even to know existed. And this structure, this golden stream of revenue, flowed not for a year or two but for over a decade, enriching Kody while leaving the others with only salaries, transforming them from equal partners into laborers in a factory they did not own. And then came the move to Las Vegas, spun on screen as a flight from religious persecution, as a family desperately seeking safety. But what if, as insiders suggest, the true reason was not legal but financial? For when you relocate nearly 20 people, uproot children, sell homes, and purchase new ones, chaos abounds, and in chaos, financial restructuring thrives. Old accounts can be closed, new corporate accounts opened, documents misplaced, trails obscured, and in that tumult, Kody consolidated power. For the 4 gleaming homes in the cul-de-sac, presented as gifts of independence to the wives, were, according to property records and insider accounts, financed not through family trusts, but through the corporation, meaning that ownership, equity, and control resided not with the women, but with Kody's company. And if a wife left, her claim to the home would be entangled, perhaps even nullified because payments had been funneled through the corporate entity, and thus a gilded cage was built, polished, and inescapable. And polishing it most carefully, according to theory, was Robyn Brown, no longer simply the 4th wife, but the de facto chief financial officer of the operation. For unlike the other women who had been raised in the insular world of plural marriage, sheltered from the mechanisms of modern finance, Robyn had lived in the broader world. She had navigated divorce, debt, and contracts. She understood the language of credit and corporations. And so while Kody wielded patriarchal authority, Robyn whispered the strategies, supplying the business playbook. And production crew members recall that in meetings, while the original wives spoke of feelings and family, Robyn sat silent until she leaned towards Kody, whispering words that seemed to guide every decision, and thus the illusion of partnership was further dismantled, replaced by a hierarchy, a corporate monarchy in which one man reigned as both husband and CEO, one wife emerged as strategist and conciliere, and the rest were reduced to salaried employees in the telling of their own lives, and for years the cameras rolled. The audience clapped, the empire expanded, and yet behind it all, behind the smiling confessions and staged family dinners, this structure, this alleged contract fraud, held fast, hidden in plain sight, shaping every choice, every move, every betrayal that would follow. It was the very mechanism, the carefully constructed vehicle, through which they could both legally and with apparent justification siphon and redirect the vast sums of money that Kody had been hoarding away from the TLC deal, a deal that the wives, for years, believed was being handled in a transparent and equitable manner, when in reality, if one examines the financial breadcrumbs and the deeply concealed ledgers, the evidence points to something much darker, much more strategic, and if true, much more sinister than the naive belief that all of the family's collective blood, sweat, and tears were being poured into a common pot. Meri, Janelle, and Christine, after all, were convinced they were being paid a straightforward salary, a modest but regular stipend that allowed them to feed their children, pay their utility bills, and with painstaking discipline, live within the confines of a restricted budget, all the while holding tightly to the idea that the remainder of the money from the show was being pooled into that nebulous, invisible family fund, a pot of shared wealth, a pot that was supposed to represent fairness and familial unity. Yet, as it turned out, that pot was allegedly being drained away, not to benefit the collective, but rather to feed a business structure that existed primarily to enrich one man, the self-appointed CEO and his favorite executive, Robyn, whose lifestyle, once scrutinized, appeared consistently incongruent with the financial hardships portrayed by her sister wives. Indeed, the evidence of this dichotomy was paraded brazenly before us, hidden in plain sight upon our television screens for years, if only we had chosen to observe with a more skeptical eye. Do you recall Robyn's endless insistence on acquiring rental homes with ever more space? Additional rooms, elaborate features that far exceeded the modest needs of her family? Do you recall the lavishly decorated parties, the expensive designer gifts showered upon her children, the holidays and indulgences that stood in stark, undeniable contrast to the quiet, desperate economizing of the other wives, who spent their nights hunched over spreadsheets, calculating down to the very penny how to keep their households afloat? It was as though two entirely separate financial realities existed simultaneously within the same family. On one side, Kody and Robyn operating under what our investigation theorizes to have been a concealed, corporate-style budget, a hidden chest of resources, and on the other side, the original wives scraping together the remnants, relying upon salaries, coupons, and sheer grit to make ends meet, while all the while clinging to a narrative of unity and shared sacrifice that was becoming increasingly detached from reality. The infamous Flagstaff fiasco, heralded with fanfare as the dawning of a new era, was in truth the culmination of this divergence, a land not of dreams fulfilled, but of promises broken, not a vision of shared paradise, but, as our sources have whispered, a meticulously engineered trap, a gilded cage in the form of Coyote Pass. If Las Vegas had symbolized Kody's consolidation of financial power, a centralized hub where his grip on the family's resources tightened ever more with each passing year, then Flagstaff was his attempt to engrave that control into permanence, a final audacious gambit to bind the others to him in perpetuity. The move to Coyote Pass was pitched romantically to the wives, cloaked in the language of roots, tradition, and togetherness, a bucolic utopia where the entire, sprawling family would at last dwell side by side upon one majestic parcel of land. But peel back the gloss of the television narrative, and what emerges is something far more chilling. Coyote Pass, far from being a dream, was allegedly a financial anchor, a multi-million-dollar weight designed not to liberate but to shackle, engineered specifically to indebt the original wives, Meri, Janelle, and Christine, to Kody's corporate empire, tethering them for life to Patriarch Productions, LLC, and to him as its sole proprietor. To understand the mechanics, one must examine the figures. The family collectively purchased Coyote Pass for $820,000, a staggering sum that necessitated the liquidation of assets across households. Janelle, famously pragmatic, contributed significantly from the sale of her Las Vegas home. Christine, too, handed over the equity she had so carefully built. Meri added hers, each woman pouring the fruits of years of toil and sacrifice into a raw, undeveloped piece of land that, on paper, represented unity, but in practice became the very instrument of their dispossession. And the pivotal question, the one the show never permitted to be asked with clarity, was this: who, in fact, owned the land? The ownership structure, when examined, was deliberately labyrinthine, a maze of names, parcels, and signatures so confounding that any layperson would struggle to discern the truth. Yet our forensic accountant, Franklin Adler, upon scrutinizing the available records, reached a startling conclusion. The balloon payments, the ongoing financial obligations, the potential funding for development, all of it was, from the outset, intended to be serviced not by the wives' individual incomes, but by one singular source: Patriarch Productions, the television money, the company that Kody alone controlled. From a purely financial perspective, the scheme was devilishly brilliant. He persuaded the wives to surrender their tangible, personal assets, their houses, their independence, their liquid wealth, and transform them into a shared, undeveloped, and essentially illiquid commodity, the land. He then tethered the realization of that investment, the dream of building homes, entirely to future funding he alone dispensed through the LLC. Thus, The wives became cash poor, stripped of independence, forced to bow before Kody in order to reclaim what was already theirs, compelled to approach him, hat in hand, begging the CEO of Patriarch Productions to release at his whim a portion of profits generated from the very stories of their lives, their heartbreaks, their sacrifices. Under the guise of building a family utopia, he had executed the ultimate power play, the reduction of his wives to employees, supplicants dependent entirely upon his goodwill, which history has shown was rarely forthcoming. And when they arrived in Flagstaff, did the building commence? Did the promised homes rise from the earth? No, the utopia remained a mirage, the ground untouched, the dream perpetually deferred. Instead, the money, as ever, flowed in a single direction. And while Janelle languished in a cramped rental or even, at one point, an RV, while Christine plotted her escape from a toxic cycle, Kody and Robyn ascended into a sprawling mansion, a palace by comparison, justified with a fog of excuses on screen. The need for more space for the younger children, the claim it was a good investment, the assertion that nothing else was available. But our financial sources suggest a far simpler truth. The mansion was not a family home in the true sense, but rather another corporate asset acquired through Patriarch Productions, whether directly by purchase or indirectly through its down payment and mortgage servicing, another jewel in Kody's crown, disguised as necessity, but in reality, a headquarters for the CEO and his chosen partner, while the rest of the workforce, his wives, were left to wander and worry. Here lies the insidious genius of the alleged fraud. As articulated by entertainment lawyer Eliza Vance, on screen, the narrative was that of a struggling family, striving together to build their dream on the land, but off-screen. The real story may have been that of a corporate entity siphoning its profits into assets for its owner, stringing along its own contributors with the illusion of a future payoff that was never intended to materialize. The wives in this scenario were not partners, not equals, but laborers funding their own disenfranchisement. Every tear shed on camera, every argument endured, every humiliating moment broadcast to millions serving to boost ratings. Ratings which translated directly into larger checks from TLC, cheques that then disappeared back into the corporate black box of Patriarch Productions, further cementing Kody's control and rendering the wives perpetually dependent upon the very man exploiting them. It was, in essence, a feedback loop of emotional turmoil and financial exploitation, and astonishingly, for years, no one within the family seemed to grasp the full scope of the trap. Blinded by decades of shared faith, shared struggle, and the assumption of trust, they could not, perhaps would not, imagine that the man who had proclaimed himself their spiritual leader, their husband, their patriarch, had erected, unseen, a corporate wall between himself and them, a wall invisible yet as impenetrable as iron, a fortress of cold, hard money. Yet even the strongest walls eventually crack, and in this case, the first fissure appeared when one wife, Christine, wearied by years of subjugation, quietly resolved that enough was enough. Her declaration, "I'm leaving you, we are divorced," was seismic, not merely the end of a spiritual marriage, but the opening salvo in Kody Brown's financial reckoning. For as Christine walked away, she carried unknowingly the key to the vault, the leverage to pry open the secrets of the TLC contract, the courage to become the first wife not merely to exit a marriage, but to challenge the corporate machinery that bound her. Her departure was not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a battle that would expose alleged frauds buried for over a decade and lay the foundations for a legal confrontation of monumental proportions. It began, as so many things in this twisted saga did, with whispers on the phone, endless hours in which voices were lowered and truths long buried finally came to the surface. For sources insist that the calls between Christine and Janelle were not idle chatter, but the quiet forging of an alliance born of shared betrayal. And on one such evening, when Janelle returned from yet another of these hushed conversations, she carried in her eyes a cold fury, an unmistakable look of horror and dawning comprehension, for she had clearly learnt something that pierced through years of misplaced trust and carefully cultivated illusions. And what exactly had she been told? We can only theorize. But the prevailing belief among those closest to the matter is that Christine, having herself faced legal battles and financial entanglements, had walked Janelle step by step through the alleged labyrinthine corporate structure underpinning the Brown family finances, exposing to her that the communal family pot, into which Janelle had dutifully poured the proceeds of her own labor and the profit from her Vegas home sale, may never have truly existed in the form she imagined, and instead all the real power, every string, Every penny of meaningful control was held within Kody's single limited liability company, a cold and calculated consolidation that left the other wives as mere contributors and not beneficiaries. A truth which, to a woman like Janelle, so proud of her business sense and her ability to manage finances, was nothing short of devastating, a revelation both personal and professional in its betrayal. For she would have felt herself made a fool, tricked into servitude, her independence stripped by deceit masquerading as family unity. Yet Janelle, unlike many, is a fighter, and once she grasped the contours of the game, the pretense, the cruel deception, she would not sit still. She would begin at once to map her escape, her strategy crystallizing with precision. She needed to liquidate, she needed immediate access to cash, and most crucially, she needed to untangle her name and her future from the financial quagmire that was Coyote Pass. A money pit disguised as a dream of shared land. And so, as sources speculate, behind the smiling facade of filmed scenes there began a tense and unyielding negotiation, with Janelle, armed not only with Christine's warnings but likely with the advice of her own counsel, stepping before Kody and laying down a demand that was anything but optional. Buy me out. Return to me the money I invested, the proceeds of the home I sacrificed. Do it now, or I will join Christine in going public with the whole sordid truth. And faced with this ultimatum, Kody and Robyn, once so assured in their dominance, now confronted the terrifying specter of rebellion on two fronts, the risk of exposure doubling, the house of cards trembling. For according to financial experts, in order to satisfy Janelle's demand, they would have had to dip directly into the corporate reserves of Patriarch Productions, the very secretive fund that had fueled their lavish lifestyle and Robyn's notorious shopping sprees. And this marked yet another unplanned withdrawal from a pot never meant to be shared fairly. So one could imagine the panic, the rage, the desperate calculations, as Franklin Adler, the forensic accountant consulted, explained. First, they had scrambled to liquidate hundreds of thousands for Christine, and now, scarcely a year later, Janelle demanded her share, another six-figure, possibly seven-figure sum, draining the so-called rainy day fund, a fund that was in truth no more than a piggy bank for Kody and Robyn's excesses. And to Robyn, the self-appointed chief executive of this domestic empire, the prospect was apocalyptic, hence her tears, so often paraded before cameras as grief for the loss of family unity, now take on a darker shade. For in this light they become not tears for love, but tears for money. The terror of a financial architect watching her carefully constructed edifice collapse. The panic of one who knows precisely which skeletons are buried where, because she herself held the spade. Every dollar diverted to Christine and Janelle, not merely money lost, but money that would never again line her own pockets. Each payment a step closer to ruin, and with Christine and Janelle now free of Kody's control, financially unbound and newly independent, a possibility long denied to them opened at last. They could compare notes, and it was in this freedom that Meri, the quiet observer on the periphery, began to take notice, to listen, to align, and thus the three original wives, the OGs as they are now called, formed a new bond, not of faith, nor of shared marriage, but of betrayal, of deception revealed. And together, they set about the painful yet liberating task of assembling the puzzle of more than a decade of lies. For according to insiders, these meetings were difficult, filled with tears yet vindicating, each woman carrying a crucial fragment. Christine with her knowledge of property disputes, Janelle with her sharp recollection of financial documents co-signed without full comprehension, Meri with her memory of lean years when every penny was counted, and whose recollections made later excesses glaringly suspicious. And so, combining their testimonies with the expertise of lawyers and forensic accountants whom they now retained, they pressed forward and unearthed what can only be described as the smoking gun. For their legal insider reports that buried among the original articles of incorporation for the family's loan-out company was proof undeniable. Kody